First of all, I think we are entering a period where numerically the protest by Iranian workers has increased dramatically. We are entering a period where over the last few months those protests have taken unprecedented extension and in itself depth as well. What are these workers protesting? Many of them are protesting against non-payment of wages, some of which aggravated by the situation of sanctions, and I will come back to that. Many of them are protesting against privatization, about the fact that the companies they worked with have been privatized, then closed down. It's not just privatization, but total closure, and therefore desperate economic situation for the families of those workers. But in addition, I think one has to understand that they are fighting at the same time against the Islamic regime, against its economic policies, for immediate economic demands, but also they are fighting against international capital, against world capitalism, not just in terms of war, but even in their economic struggles in a country that is following and is named the best example of IMF's new economic agenda in the region. Obviously, the ways they react to those policies is by going on strike, is by protesting, and those protests really reflect in their nature, in their very nature, their opposition to international capital, to world capitalism. Sanctions have hit the Iranian working class the hardest, in my opinion, partly because they have forced them into this day-to-day economic struggle that in the long term weakens the working class. We are obviously in favor of workers' struggles, but we don't want desperation of workers, as we have seen in examples in the last few weeks in Iran, where on one particular demonstration outside one of the government offices, workers were shouting, "Isn't there anyone to help us? Is there no one hearing what we are saying?" And that is a voice of desperation. And that desperation is partly because of the economic policies of the regime, some of which were mentioned by Behruz, the rate of inflation, massive scale of unemployment, but some of it is also to do with firms making people unemployed directly as a result of sanctions. Whether it is a capitalist using this excuse to sacking people, or whether it's really the direct, straightforward result of sanctions is irrelevant here. The reality is that for the Iranian worker, associated, say, with the Iran car industry, where many have been made unemployed because spare parts can't get into Iran, where a worker in the petrochemical industry made unemployed because many of the contracts, including some that had been signed and finished with Japanese companies, with the Italian companies, and with Shell, have now been put aside because these companies have come under pressure by the UN and the US for sanction busting. They've pulled out of the contract. The result of it is that the Iranian worker who was supposed to get a job, who had a job in these projects or was supposed to get a job, he moved to those projects, has been made redundant. So we are facing a massive direct influence of what is happening regarding sanctions for the Iranian working class. And obviously, this is strengthening the regime, because any regime that is following a neoliberal economic agenda wants to find excuses for its terrible policies against the working class, wants to have excuses to force repression and so on. Despite all this, and despite the fact that I did refer to many of the protests of the Iranian workers being about day-to-day issues, despite the fact that some of these are in their nature very economic in the immediate demands they present, there is a very serious political character to most of these protests as well. And the political character is the repression inevitably forces the workers to oppose that repression, and there is struggle between the security forces and the working class. There are many workers who are arrested. Any attempt at organizing the workers outside the framework of the totally spy elements of the regime within the Islamic Shura is confronted by attacks by the regime. And therefore, you can't divide the political and economic issues in the struggles of a working class against the dictatorship. There are attempts at creating nationwide organizations. One of the major complaints of the workers themselves is that they have suffered from lack of nationwide organizations, and there are many attempts, at least two serious attempts, at creating a nationwide coordinating committee of various political strike committees, various workers' committees. Amongst those, as in the student movement, the debate rages about whether one can work openly or whether one should work secretly. There are arguments about whether syndicalism is the answer or a more radical approach of organizing the working class in hidden strike committees, secret strike committees, is the answer. Many of these are issues that we, as in solidarity with the Iranian working class, cannot intervene in, but we should be aware and realistic of those contradictions, those differences, and try and help the arguments if we have a particular point of view on it. I think in HOPI we have always emphasized that we want to see the Iranian working class organized, but in order to see the Iranian working class organized, one has to accept the fact that the threat of war is one of the most serious obstacles to any form of independent working class organization. It has worked into the hands of the Iranian regime for increasing its repression of the working class. I would emphasize that the Iranian working class isn't just another case of solidarity. It's not just another case of international solidarity. This is the working class who, after all, 30 years ago, almost to the month, managed one of the biggest, most important strikes of the 20th century, the oil strike and the strike of millions of ordinary employees, workers in Iran that overthrew the island of stability of the United States, the Shah's Iran. This is the working class that in 3 decades of opposing the Islamic regime has no illusions about political Islam. In many ways, it is the only working class in the region where, irrespective of what Behruz clearly, rightly described as its practical day-to-day attitude towards spiritual issues, has no illusions about political Islam being able to answer its economic or its anti-imperialist aspirations. That is why, for anyone on the left who is anti-war, for anyone who sees the struggle of the working class internationally as part of its fight, the support for the Iranian working class is on a different level than just another solidarity. Because of the region where it is situated, because of the recent history of its struggle, but also because it is, in my opinion, the only beacon of hope in that sea of political Islamic fundamentalism and Sharia, attitudes toward Sharia and political Islam. However, support for Iranian workers isn't divorced from reality, is not divorced from political reality. We are facing a war in that region. Irrespective of what happens to Iran itself, the events in Iraq and Afghanistan influence the day-to-day lives of Iranian people and Iranian workers. But also the threat of war and sanctions have given it a more immediate nature. We cannot, as some people have written, and I think Torab alluded to those in the morning, one cannot write that the struggles of the Iranian working class are irrelevant to the issue of war, that one can show solidarity with the Iranian working class, at the same time support bombing of Iran by Israel or anybody else. One cannot say that we are for the Iranian working class, but on the other hand, let's not complicate the issue by bringing imperialism or threat of war or sanctions into this. That is not what the activists of the labor movement in Iran are telling us. Over the last months or so, we are hearing echoes of what some of us had been saying for a decade now. For at least 6 or 7 years, some of us have been arguing that solidarity with Iranian workers that comes from dubious forces, from Solidarity Center, from CIA-affiliated organizations, for international NGOs which have associations with funds given by the United States, are damaging to the Iranian working class. I can only tell you that that was an underestimation of the level of feeling we are hearing now from workers inside Iran. Workers inside Iran are far angrier that people have jeopardized their strike, have jeopardized their political action by not taking a strong stance against Solidarity Center, against CIA-backed unions. And if we are to show that solidarity, if HOPI is to pursue the policy of solidarity with Iranian workers, we must be very clear that we will strengthen the positions we took 6th of March 2008. We should be much stronger in repelling any coordination, any activity when Iranian workers are telling us we don't want that kind of solidarity. That's damaging our members. And for those reasons, I think that we do need to build a different kind of solidarity, one that isn't based on getting signatures of this or other trade union bureaucrat, one that is based in both informing, educating, letting people know about what's going on in Iran, but also one that puts at the center of its activities the issue of war and the issue of sanctions. These are now directly related to the day-to-day struggles of the Iranian working class, and we cannot separate them.
Okay, thank you. Oh, sorry.
It's okay. So I think when we do face other activities, when people say, oh, well, this is just about workers, we're not going to mention war, let me tell you, it's not because they have forgotten it. It's because there is another agenda behind it. And we should ask, why isn't there an anti-war slogan? Why isn't there an anti-sanction slogan? The vast sections of the Iranian opposition that Torab alluded to in the morning are now, I'm afraid, in exile, corrupted by the fundings of the CIA and in its many different forms and shapes. And in HOPI, where we remain an anti-war movement, by definition, we must be very clear about those differences and challenge those who want to work us on every point about their stance on imperialism, on war, and on the Islamic Republic. Thank you.